lastly but not least, metal face sandwich patterns. So these four products were designated exotic products back then, and it was understood that something more had to be done for this type of products, these exotic products. And it was actually, a note was added to the Euroclass decision that the linear products should have the system had to be developed further for linear products like cables and pipes. Now, since we could find a correlation between the SBI and the ISO 9705 test when we took away those four exotic products, it was possible to start defining class limits in the SBI test based on the test results we had in the room corner test. So, to the definition of the class limits. When we looked at the room corner test, we actually very clearly had four clusters of products, and that was based on time to flash over. We have the products that never went to flash over in the room corner, those that went to flash over during the 300 kilowatt phase from 10 to 20 minutes, those that went to flash over in the 100 kilowatt phase but after 2 minutes, and those that went to flash over within the first 2 minutes of the test. Since it was agreed that time to flash over was the most critical parameter, these four clusters were used to identify the class limits in the SBI test. So, what did we actually then learn from the room corner, or from the round robin here? And this is what I was maybe naive enough to call the capabilities of the SBI test. Well, what we learned was that it could test 26 of the 30 products with a correlation to the room corner test. So that wasn't too bad. For the last four products, as I said, the exotic products, other solutions had to be found, but for some weird reason, it was only cables and pipes that was in the regulators' minds back then when they had this little footnote to the Commission decision. Now, to build on this, Bjørn Sundström from SP made a whole thesis. I will almost call him Dr. Fiker or Dr. SBI. He made a whole thesis on the classification system, European classification system. He actually showed that for about 90% of construction products, the SBI test is capable of predicting the fire hazard because there is a link to the room corner, because there is a link to the time to flash over in the room corner. And that's not too bad for a fire test, not too bad. But what about the last 10% of products? What are we going to do about those? Now you see, the strength of the Euroclass system is that it actually leaves open the possibility of defining a correct test method for those products where the SBI test is not appropriate. For this we have to look to the guidance paper G. This guidance paper, it defines the role of the reference scenario and the large-scale reference test, but what it also does is provide a procedure for appealing for the use of another test than the SBI. However, as Vince nicely pointed out with his presentation and the quote he gave from this guidance paper, all the burden of proof lies upon you. You have to prove why the SBI test is wrong. And then you might be allowed to use something else if they agree with you. This is a tough process. Believe me, I speak from experience. But since we have this procedure, it is actually possible to define test methods which are capable of predicting the fire hazard of at least the last 10% of construction products, if we follow this procedure. That's the big if. I'm going to skip quickly over this. There was some further work done on mounting and fixing and directly extended fields of application, but I actually want to spend more time on other issues. And I can see time's running. One of the things I would like to talk about is end-use application. I've heard this phrase used by other speakers as well, and this became a very, very highly discussed issue when the SBI test was developed. Because one thing is when you thought that when the test was developed, all problems were solved. No way. It was just the beginning of the discussions. Because in the classification standard, it is written that the test result is to be related to the end-use application. Now, this is very interesting, because how is this supposed to be interpreted? What are we supposed to test then? Shall we test the materials? That means every single material within a product. Split layer products and test everything? Should we test the product? Or should we just test the entire building element? because that's where the product is used in the end use. That we take the whole wall and put that in the SBI. That was a long discussion, and believe me, this was close to derailing what I would believe is the only way of having safety in the Euroclass system. Some people argue strongly that we should test building elements in the SBI. Luckily enough, some people went back and looked at the history, which I went over with you in the beginning, and saw that the class limits had been based on product testing, not on material testing, not on testing of building elements, but the class limits have been defined based on product testing. So therefore, finally, one of the CEN consultants finally came out and said, for CE marking purposes, the product that's placed on the market shall be tested exposed to the flames of the test. I breathed a sigh of relief, because if we've tested only the finished building elements, all construction products would have had the same classification. I want to return then to the 10% where we have problems with SBI. And as I mentioned earlier, there was a little note added to the Commission decision on the Euroclass system about linear products. And linear products, they include pipes, pipe insulation, and cables. And some solutions have actually been made for two of these product groups, and that is for pipe insulation and for cables. New classification systems have been developed for cables. This even includes a whole new range of tests that was developed based on a large European study. For pipe insulation, they stayed with the SBI test and the room corner test, but they defined an alternative way of mounting and fixing them in the test, and therefore also different class limits. So I would say that the cables and pipe installations are very, very good examples of following the basic principle behind the Euroclass system to develop the system to take into account those problematic products, or problematic according to the SBI.